If there was ever a character who would show up at this time, it would be Ted Kennedy. Are you kidding me? My mind is blown. I cannot even. If I had written this as a movie script, I never, ever would have done this. Because I would have thought, oh no, nobody would believe that. No one would believe that Ted Kennedy would do this to somebody who... Oh, no, that's too much. We can't make him that much of a villain. Believe it! Hello, how are you? Welcome to my channel. Today we are going to continue with the other Mrs. Kennedy, and this chapter is shocking. Shocking. Usually I read ahead what I'm supposed to read for the morning, and I was busy yesterday and I didn't, and I was like, that's okay, I'll just get on camera and start reading. But I kind of wanted to know a little bit about what was going to happen, so it's just sort of like, you know, I was doing my makeup and like flicking through the chapters and seeing like, okay, where are we going today? I had not expected this turn of events. So if you've read the book, you know it's coming, but I didn't know that this was coming. So, I mean, I just stood there dumbfounded, looking at what I was reading and thinking, well, that is a plot twist. So, bear with me. Let's go. We're still in the section called Bobby's Wife, but this chapter is called Marrying Them Off, and we're going to talk about all the other siblings, and it's very short. It's like a page and a half, but kind of setting up where everybody is. Between 1954 and 1958, the rest of the Kennedy and Skakel children would get married. In June 1954, Pat Kennedy, the most attractive of the Kennedy girls, tall, auburn-haired, violet-eyed, married Peter Lawford. Pat had been starstruck since childhood, when her father was in the movie business, and she had met a number of Hollywood celebrities. Rose Kennedy was violently opposed to Lawford, because he wasn't a Catholic, and Joe disliked him because he was an Englishman. The patriarch was still smarting from the negative treatment the British accorded him when he was an ambassador. Pat and Peter settled into a Hollywood lifestyle on the beach in Malibu. They had 4 children between 1955 and 1961. But the union was troubled due to Lawford's obsessive womanizing and bizarre sexual proclivities. The Kennedys made every effort to avoid a scandal, sending both Bobby and Ethel in as peacemakers. But in 1966, the Lawfords, after a long separation, were divorced. It was later revealed that Lawford had helped procure women for Jack Kennedy. A couple of months after the Kennedy-Lawford merger, Big Ann and George Skakel reluctantly announced the engagement of their youngest, Anne, the prettiest of the Skakel girls, to John Henry McCooey, a good-looking, brash Irishman of 25, a Georgetown University graduate who was the namesake and grandson of the late Democratic Party boss of Brooklyn. McCooey was not greeted with open arms by the fiercely Republican Skakels, although eventually he would turn out to be as much of a Kennedy detractor as the Skakels. Party affiliation, however, had less to do with Big Ann and George Sr.'s dismay about McCooey than their daughter's decision to quit Manhattanville, where she was a junior, to marry him. A week after the engagement announcement, Big Ann and George took Ann off to Europe in an unsuccessful effort to change her mind. On October 2nd, 1954, Anne Skakel stood at the altar with John McCooey in St. Mary's Roman Catholic Church, where Ethel, Georgie Ann, and Pat had had their weddings. The Reverend John J. Kavanaugh, the former president of the University of Notre Dame, officiated. Ethel, to whom Anne would always be devoted, was a matron of honor. The bridesmaids included Georgie Ann, Anne's sister-in-law Pat Curran Skakel, and Anne Reynolds, who was engaged to Rushton Skakel. The Skakel boys, Jimmy, George, and Rushton, were among the ushers. It was another spectacular Skakel wedding, but nowhere near as extravagant and elaborate or as publicized as Ethel's, who had become an instant celebrity by marrying a Kennedy. The Skakels' wedding gift to Anne, however, was certainly extraordinary. A solid gold, 7-piece service, appraised at $30,000 at the time, that had once been a gift to the Queen of England. In time, the McCooey marriage would also fall apart. The only member of the Skakel family still to get married was Rushton, who would tie the knot in 1955 with Anne Reynolds, and another Manhattanville graduate. The closest Kennedy woman to Ethel, Jean, would marry Steve Smith in 1956, and in 1958, the youngest Kennedy boy, Ted, would walk down the aisle with Joan Bennett. All right, let's talk some politics, shall we? This chapter is entitled Kennedy versus Kahn. I had mispronounced his name last episode. I think I pronounced it as Cohen because I know somebody of the same spelling who pronounces it that way, but somebody in the comments corrected me, so it's Kahn, Roy Kahn. While Joy McCarthy and Roy Kahn were conducting their highly publicized witch hunts at the Voice of America State Department and their government agencies, Bobby was involved in more mundane matters. He'd hoped to participate in McCarthy's major investigations, but as it turned out, Bobby was assigned to assist committee investigator Laverne Duffy find ways to shut off the shipment of American allies of strategic materials to Soviet countries. Bobby was quoted several times in the press, particularly in the Boston Post, which favored the Kennedy family. As a sop to old Joe, McCarthy invited Bobby to be at his side when the senator announced that a large group of Greek shipping magnates had agreed to stop carrying goods to communist China, an agreement reached in part because of young Kennedy's research. Even Roy Kahn, who couldn't stomach Bobby, described him as a vigorous prosecutor during that period. In recognition for the, quote, excellent work he'd been doing, Bobby received a $7.35 a week raise, bringing his annual salary to $5,334.57. Not long after, he was given another raise of $2,000. Ethel couldn't have been prouder, periodically showing up at the committee offices with girlfriends in tow to catch a glimpse of Bobby in shirt sleeves at work. Breathlessly, she'd introduce her pals to Joe McCarthy and Roy Kahn and ask them to sign autographs. It was during those visits to Bobby's office that Ethel, who'd been working hard on improving her husband's public image by upgrading his wardrobe, noticed that while he now wore suits, white shirts, and ties to the office, articles she'd personally selected, he still chose to wear white sweat socks, giving him the look of a bumpkin as he walked determinedly down the halls of the Senate office building. Thereafter, before he left for Capitol Hill each morning, she'd personally inspect him from head to toe to make certain he was color-coordinated. Ethel's visits to Bobby's office in those days set the pattern for his entire career. She'd usually be seated in the first row at his hearings, nervously at first, more confidently later, eventually brazenly and arrogantly, cheering him, offering moral support. For now, though, Bobby's profile was low and his public appearances scant. I don't really think there are that many guys who watch this channel. But if you are a guy, let me know. How would you feel if your wife kept showing up to your office and then was always in the front row of everything that you did? Would it be a little bit too much, or would you like that kind of support? It seems like it'd be a little bit intrusive in my way of thinking. I don't know if I would want my partner there all the time. Like every opportunity that he had to be there, he was coming. And even if it was a supportive role, it's just sort of like, come for the big things, but you needn't be here all the time. I don't know, is that not good that I think that? It just seems like a lot. Like, don't come to work with me so much. Well, Ethel was exuberant about Bobby's close association with McCarthy. Her father was not, and this caused more family friction. While strongly opposed to communism, George Skakel despised McCarthy and his tactics, referring to the senator as a worthless rattlebrain. Skakel had been mortified when Ethel had told him that Bobby had gone to work for the senator. George Skakel rarely entertained confrontation, but he clearly made his displeasure known to Ethel, whom he loved dearly. During the time Bobby was affiliated with McCarthy, George Skakel Sr. and Big Ann never once visited their daughter and her family in Washington. Despite the high esteem in which he held McCarthy, Bobby suddenly quit the subcommittee after only 7 months. Most knowledgeable sources agree that he resigned in a snit because Roy Kahn wielded the power that Bobby coveted. Bobby turned in his resignation on July 29, 1953, using the excuse that he intended to enter private law practice. Years later in his book, The Enemy Within, he blamed Kahn for his decision to quit, though even then he equivocated. Rather than admitting that a power struggle and feud existed, he asserted that he left because most of the subcommittee's investigations were based on, quote, some preconceived notion of Kahn's. By blaming Kahn for the subcommittee's problems, he gave McCarthyism and the senator a clean bill of health, blaming McCarthy only for, quote, allowing the committee to function in such a fashion. Bobby was unemployed for only a few weeks when his father came to his rescue, obviously, and hired him as his assistant on the Commission on Reorganization of the Executive Branch, the so-called Hoover Commission, headed by 80-year-old former President Herbert Hoover. Bobby quickly grew bored in the musty atmosphere of the commission. Anxious for more action, he also became irritable and temperamental. One night, Bobby showed up at Jack's house with his face bruised and bloodied. Ethel was horrified and rushed to his side, thinking that he had been mugged in the street. Actually, he'd been playing touch football with Teddy and some friends, and he'd gotten into a fist fight with a few Georgetown University students who had ignored Bobby's request to stop hitting baseballs into the midst of their game. Bobby, in one of his dark moods, threw the first punch. That must have been a rough game of touch, Ethel said quietly over dinner. but Bobby pretended not to hear her and never gave her an explanation for what really had happened. Wow. That would have made some news. He's lucky that he lived in a day when you could keep, stories like that secret, but getting into a fist fight with some university students, what? Y'all are all playing touch football and they're hitting baseballs into your game and you just decide to go over and beat them up. I don't know if that's the way members of government should be conducting themselves. Bobby's angst ended with the start of the new year, 1954. He had a new job and a namesake. On January 17th, after an easy pregnancy, Ethel delivered her third child, their second son, Robert F. Kennedy, Jr. As usual, Luella Hennessy was there to hold Ethel's hand and to comfort her. Preparing to return home after a week's stay at Georgetown University Hospital, Ethel grew concerned about how Kathleen and Joe would react to the new baby. She finally came up with a plan, and she used it after every subsequent birth. When she'd get home, all the children would be waiting as she carried the baby up the walk, Hennessy said. They'd just go mad about it and they'd want to hold it and talk to it, and Ethel would say, "Look at what the new baby brought home to you." And they'd each get a basket with a gift, and then they'd each kiss the baby and say thank you, and it was quite a good idea. Hennessy remained with Ethel and the baby for several more days. In 18 months, she'd return when Ethel gave birth on June 15th, 1955, to number 4, the third son, David Anthony Kennedy. Within a couple of weeks of leaving the Hoover Commission, Bobby received a job offer he couldn't refuse. The 3-member Democratic minority of the McCarthy subcommittee had gotten authorized to hire their own counsel. When Bobby heard about the position, he immediately called his father, who made a few discreet inquiries, and virtually overnight secured the job for his son. Bobby now returned to the subcommittee with a bit more power, and just in time for its biggest show ever. On April 22, 1954, the Army-McCarthy hearings began, mesmerizing the nation for 36 days, attracting as many as 20 million viewers to the televised proceedings. The hearings, which were the beginnings of the end for McCarthy, focused on his allegation that communists had influenced the Army. Denying the charges, the Army counterattacked, accusing McCarthy and Kahn of using their influence to get better military treatment for Kahn's pal, G. David Schein, who'd worked as a committee investigator before he was drafted. As minority counsel, Bobby had little to do but sit behind the 3 Democratic senators, acting as a glorified gopher, spending most of his time coming up with questions for them to ask. Each day, Ethel would leave the children with their nurse and drive to Capitol Hill, where, for the first time, she was noticed by the press, the beaming, pert wife of the young Kennedy boy. Like the rest of the country, Ethel sat transfixed, but all of her attention was riveted on Bobby. It wasn't until a week before the hearings concluded that Ethel's hero emerged from virtual anonymity. On Friday, June 11th, Bobby and his nemesis Roy Cohn almost got into a fistfight outside the hearing room. That day, Senator Henry M. Jackson, using questions supplied by Bobby, heatedly went after Schein in a curious 15-point plan he'd conceived for promoting democracy in places that appeared likely to fall to communism. Cohn was furious at what he later called a burlesque by Bobby. He noted that every time Bobby handed Jackson a question, the senator, quote, would go into fits of laughter. When the session finally ended, a fuming Cohn confronted Bobby. As their shouting match grew louder, a crowd, including a number of reporters, gathered. "There's only one way to settle this," Cohn said, as he started to throw a punch at Bobby. 2 spectators grabbed Cohn, Bobby ducked, and the blow missed. Cohn later stated that since touch football wasn't one of his, quote, long suits, I probably was the gainer in stopping of the fight. The next day, the front page headline in the New York Daily News read, "Cohn, Kennedy near blows in hate clash." Laverne Duffy, who eyewitnessed the showdown, recalled later, "Ethel just loved it. I looked down and I saw her fists clenched. I was worried she was going to jump into the middle of the brawl and kick Cohn in the balls. She was Bobby's staunchest defender." Okay. What is little Ethel doing there? Standing there like a little elf. She just can't wait to see the fight. Okay. Now, this chapter is entitled "A Last Goodbye," and this is where I stood there befuddled, shocked, horrified at the following passage. So if you haven't read the book, buckle up, because this was a bit of a shock to me. For months during 1954 and 1955, Georgia began shuttled in one of Great Lake Carbon's converted World War II B-26 attack bombers. Whoa. Between Connecticut and California, where George was putting the finishing touches on his latest venture, the private and commercial development of thousands of acres of the verdant Palo Verdes Peninsula just south of Los Angeles. George Skakel's leap from coke and coal into the more glamorous world of Southern California real estate had come about unexpectedly during the company's search in the early 50s for diatomaceous earth, a type of dirt used as a filtering agent in the manufacture of some of Great Lakes' products. While core drilling in the Palos Verdes Hills, J. Mayhew struck a large deposit of diatomite on land that Great Lakes Carbon had leased from the estate of the late economist Frank Arthur Vanderlip. When George Skakel learned that the Vanderlips would rather sell than lease, an extremely favorable price was negotiated, and Skakel picked up thousands of acres, including 2 miles of highly desirable land fronting on the Pacific Ocean for $1,000 an acre, a cool $9 million, which he paid in cash. Skakel quickly sold just 1 acre to Shell Oil for 100 times what he had paid for it. As it turned out, the moisture content of the diatomaceous earth was too high, so Skakel shut down the mining operation and set up a real estate development division. Hiring the best architects and engineers, he envisioned beautiful homes, golf courses, tennis courts, swimming pools, and upscale shopping centers, all sitting high above the Pacific and within easy commuting distance of Los Angeles. By the time the land purchase was consummated, Skakel had already turned over much of the day-to-day operations of Great Lakes Carbon to George Jr., who succeeded his father as president in April 1953, with George Sr. now serving as chairman. "My father needed a new challenge," said Rushton Skakel. The Palos Verdes project became his baby. Once Skakel decided to develop the property, which eventually would earn tens of millions of dollars for the company, he and Big Ann became regular transcontinental commuters. Skakel even installed a custom lift in the belly of one of his planes to make it easier for his wife to get on and off board. George Skakel loved to fly, and he was one of the first businessmen to make regular use of airplanes for business travel. As early as 1920, when he had just started out, he'd wrangle his way aboard the biplanes that crisscrossed the country carrying mail, and were later bought by barnstormers and charter pilots, many of whom received handsome fares from George Skakel to ensure that he could get to a meeting in a distant city on time. As the years passed, Skakel decided it was more convenient to have his own planes, so he began buying surplus military aircraft from the government for a song and had them converted to civilian use. When the planes weren't being used for business, they became an integral part of the company perks the Skakels enjoyed. They'd fly anywhere on a lark, particularly the brothers who worked for the company. George Jr., now president of Great Lakes Carbon, was constantly taking off with his chums for weekend hunting, fishing, and skiing jaunts. A practical joker, George would sometimes have his friends arrive at the airport dressed for skiing, and hours later they'd find themselves disembarking at a sun-baked airstrip in Cuba. The Skakel planes also were a source of constant family friction, particularly among the Skakel girls, Ethel, Pat, and Anne, whose husbands didn't work for Great Lakes Carbon and who therefore were ineligible for company benefits. Ethel's lack of access to the planes rankled Bobby. "Yeah, but we've read about them flying back and forth from Charlottesville on these planes, so how cut off were they? I don't know." "The Kennedys didn't have a plane before Jack became president because they were too cheap to buy one," said George Terrian, "so they were always trying to get freebie rides on the Skakel planes." Remembering Christmas 1954, Mary Begley said Bobby had deigned to accompany Ethel to Greenwich, but then he wanted to get the hell back, and I remember Bobby saying, "We got to get back to Washington, we'll take the plane." He didn't even ask Mr. and Mrs. Skakel for their permission. Ethel's brothers, all of them, abhorred Bobby's pushiness when it came to the planes. They also were furious that Ethel never once spoke up in defense of her family's feelings, which she was well aware of. Instead of being a source of luxurious pleasure for the family, the planes, as it turned out, sparked enmity and greed. And in the end, they also would become the cause of crushing tragedy. On the evening of Sunday, October 2nd, 1955, George and Ann Skakel threw a first wedding anniversary party at Lake Avenue for little Ann and her husband John McCooey. With another trip to California set for the next morning, the senior Skakels left the festivities early. They had a full schedule ahead of them. This time out, George had meetings scheduled with Marcel Brewer, the noted Bauhaus-trained architect and designer who'd been retained to work on the Palo Verdes project. George also planned to make a stop in Salt Lake City to meet with J. Mayhew, and Big Ann was looking forward to a layover in Chicago to visit her friend Florence Comfer. Monday, October 3rd, 1955, dawned fair and warm. Little Ann decided to see off her parents at Bridgeport Airport, the starting point of their flight to Los Angeles. The plane was already on the tarmac waiting for the Skakels' arrival. Following custom, the old man chatted with Joe Whitney, the pilot, and Johnny McBride, the co-pilot, both veterans of the Skakel fleet. Whitney reported that the weather looked good, that the intense safety check, which had been designed by son-in-law John Dodell, had been made, and that the ship was fueled and ready for takeoff. Little Ann hugged her mother. "Say hello to Aunt Florence for me," and kissed her father on the cheek. Then she walked to the passenger area to watch the plane take off. George Skakel was quite fond of the old bomber, but others found the plane uncomfortable. Passengers were forced to sit in the bomb bay section and had to crawl on their bellies to get from one end of the ship to the other, and a few had recently questioned its safety. About 6 months before the Skakels took off that October day, Great Lakes attorney Tom Hayes and another company executive, Danny Crimmins, had taken a flight aboard the plane that had left them feeling intensely uneasy. "We smelled gas. Fuel fumes," said Hayes years later, and I told one of the pilots, and he said, nah, I don't think so. But I was afraid to fly in it. George and Ann Skakel buckled their seatbelts. Ann Whitney switched on the engines and throttled the big plane at the end of the runway, awaiting clearance to begin his takeoff, as Johnny McBride made a last-minute instrument check. He held up his thumb to indicate that everything was okay. A few minutes later, the control tower radioed permission for them to depart. From behind the fence, Ann McCooey watched as the old plane lumbered down the runway and lifted off. Its first stop would be Tulsa for refueling. She gave one last wave, went to the car, and was driven back to Lake Avenue by one of the Skakel chauffeurs. Chapter 49. End of an Era. A maid answered the telephone at Sursum Quarter early in the morning of Tuesday, October 4th, 1955. Big Ann's social secretary was on the phone asking to speak to Georgianne. "She's still asleep," the servant responded. "Please wake her, it's important." Georgianne picked up the phone in her bedroom. "I'm terribly sorry to bother you so early," the secretary said. "But what's all this nonsense I hear about your parents being dead?" Georgianne froze, then immediately jumped to the conclusion that it was somebody's idea of a sick practical joke. "That's absurd," she said, annoyed, and hung up the phone. But a few minutes later, when the maid brought her the morning paper, the eldest of the Skakel children learned the horrible truth from the Greenwich Time. The front-page banner headline blared, "Mr. Mrs. Skakel, 2 pilots died in plane crash. Exploded in mid-air over Oklahoma. Were flying to coast on business trip." The story went on to say that George and Big Ann, both 63 years old, had been killed instantly. The crash had occurred at about 11:15 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, not long after the plane had taken off from its refueling stop in Tulsa during a torrential rainstorm. Joe Whitney had radioed to Oklahoma City Airport that he was having some sort of trouble and needed to land immediately, but he was advised that the weather made an instrument approach hazardous. That was the last contact with the plane. Moments later, farmers in rural area 3 miles north of Union City heard an explosion and an eerie screaming whine. Thinking it was a meteor or even a flying saucer, the UFO sighting hysteria was at its peak in this time of the country, they called the police. The first to reach the wreckage scattered over the wide area of a muddy field was Oklahoma State Highway Patrolman. Somehow, among the molten and smoldering pieces of twisted metal, they found what was left of the bodies. Had one of the rescue workers not stumbled across a diner's club credit card with George Skakel's name on it and Joe Whitney's wallet, it might have taken hours more for authorities to make an identification. As she read the story, Georgianne began to tremble so hard that her husband thought she was having a convulsion. He ordered her to take a stiff drink and lie down, but she knew that she had to get the family together as quickly as possible. She picked up the phone and started dialing. Her brother Rushton was already at his desk at Great Lakes Carbon Facility in St. Louis, unaware, like the others, of his parents' death. When Georgianne told him what had happened, he fell ill, paralyzed, his eyes filled with tears. "Oh, wow, it was such a shock, I couldn't believe it," he said later, recalling the moment. Rushton got on a plane and headed north to Lake Avenue, where the Skakel family and close friends had begun to gather. The lights burned bright late into the night at the mansion, where George Jr. had taken charge of overseeing the return of his parents' remains and the arrangements for the funeral. Outside, police and private guards were posted to protect the Skakels' privacy. Meanwhile, the inner circle had started gathering in Big Ann's sacred library. George Jr. and his wife Pat, who were drinking heavily, a red-eyed Rushton and his wife Anne, who just arrived from St. Louis, a shocked little Anne, the last of the children to see her parents alive, and her husband, and Jim Skakel, now separated from his wife Virginia, who'd been located in Atlanta and was on her way to Greenwich. Also en route were Pat and Luann Cuff, who were trying desperately to get a flight from Dublin. Mark McNally had arrived, and so had George Terrian, who'd flown down from the company's offices in Canada. There were priests to give solace, and friends and business associates to offer whatever assistance they could. Only one family member was conspicuously absent. Ethel. Mary Begley, who was at the house that horrible night, recalled the scene years later. George had called Ethel in Washington, but Bobby got on the phone and said, "No, Ethel's not coming to Greenwich. She will come after you make the funeral arrangements. She will come only to the funeral, but she's not coming up now." Bobby didn't give a reason. Maybe he was being protective of her, no one knew. The Kennedys didn't give reasons for what they did. George and Rushton and Georgianne, all of them, were furious with Bobby. They were all saying, "Ethel should be here. Why does she put up with him? Why doesn't she just come up here on her own? My God, mother and father are dead." I do remember them saying of Bobby, "It's so typical of that little Napoleon to not let her come." But Ethel always deferred to Bobby, a vindictive little soul. That is ridiculous. I mean, of course, all the children had really physical reactions to the hearing that their parents were dead, that Rushton should have gone momentarily paralyzed and blind is pretty shocking. And that Georgianne's shaking to the point of looking as though she's having a seizure. So I don't know what Ethel's reaction was when she found out that her parents were dead, but it could have been that Bobby thought, I don't want to put her through more of that. I want to protect her from it, but really should have let her say that to her siblings, or at least let her speak for herself so that it didn't look like he was controlling the narrative. But then again, he might have been. He didn't like the Skakels anyway. He didn't want to, have to find a sitter, find some help, watch the kids while his wife goes up to go hang out with her family with all cry on each other's necks. Like, that's so dumb. There's no reason, there's nothing she can do, so why should she go? And that's how these controlling sorts are. They decide what you should and shouldn't participate in as a family member. The excuse is always, well, there's nothing you can do anyway. I don't expect to be able to do anything, but I want to be with people who are hurting in the same way that I am hurting. I don't want to be alone, hurting alone. I want to be with my siblings who understand what this pain is. I don't know why Bobby got involved. Anyway, Begley herself had been tracked down by Georgianne at Yankee Stadium, where she and her husband had been watching the first final of the World Series between the Yankees and the Dodgers. During her frantic drive back to Greenwich, Begley had remembered a recent curious conversation she'd had with Big Ann, who, surveying all the antiques, books, artifacts, and objects she'd accumulated over the years, said suddenly, "Dear God, you spend the first half of your life collecting and the second half of your life getting rid of it all." Looking back now, it seemed to her as if Mrs. Skakel, not an introspective woman, had some premonition of what was to come. While flying north to be with Jim and the others, Virginia Skakel had dozed fitfully, remembering a recent surprise visit she'd had from her father-in-law. George had taken it upon himself to fly down to Miami on the B-26 to talk to Virginia in hopes of bringing about a reconciliation with his son. Over cocktails at the Old Forge on 41st Street, he told Virginia, "The whole family wants you to stay. Jimmy's a wonderful person. Why don't you give it another chance?" Although she was touched, Virginia's answer was no. "Mr. Skakel," she said, "I don't think it's going to work. I just think it's best we part when we're young." A crestfallen George Skakel flew back home that night. It was the last time Virginia Skakel saw him alive. She arrived at Lake Avenue just as 4 mortuary employees were carrying the 2 caskets bearing the remains of George and Ann Skakel into the house. A dynasty was gone, she thought. The mother and father had run everything. When the caskets were brought in, the Skakel brothers and sisters knelt down and said the rosary. "But they showed no emotions," recalled Virginia Skakel. "They're absolutely basket cases, but you'd never know it." At Georgianne's direction, the caskets were moved into the library and placed in the same spot where, displayed every Christmas, was an extraordinary nativity scene designed by artists from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, featuring priceless Neapolitan religious figures that Big Ann had collected over the years. Since George Skakel wasn't a Catholic, how could he be buried in a Catholic cemetery next to his wife? Word began emanating from Lake Avenue, to the disbelief of many, that just prior to taking the ill-fated flight, George had promised Big Ann that he would convert. The story even had it that he had a rosary in his hand when he was found. If anyone questioned how the beads would have survived the explosion, fire, and impact, no one raised their voices. There were 3 witnesses, a Trappist monk, a local pastor, and another priest who heard my father say he would convert, Jim Skakel maintained years later. My father said, "When I come back from California, I'm going to be baptized." Discussing his father's purported decision later, Rushton Skakel curiously chuckled, said, It was a miracle. Bob Skakel, George's nephew, scoffed at the reports. I think it's something his children wanted to believe, he said. George McCooey said he'd never heard a word from George Skakel regarding his conversion plans. But it doesn't really matter if they made it up. It was just nice, and he could be buried next to her. I know my wife Anne was very pleased that he was allowed to be buried as a Catholic. In the end, though, the question was irrelevant. According to Martin McNally, the church decided to waive all the rules because of Big Anne's longtime friendship and affiliation with Catholic leaders. It was all myth, McNally said, but the family started believing it themselves. The funeral service was held on Friday, October 7th, with hundreds of friends and business associates present for the solemn requiem high mass at St. Mary's Catholic Church. Some 25 priests were at the altar, and the Manhattanville choir sang. The immediate family sat in the front row. Ethel had arrived with Bobby the night before. I hugged her, but she didn't say a word, recalled Virginia Skakel. There's no tears from her, or from any of them. Instead of crying, they laughed. It was their way of coping. It was the only way they could cope. When everyone had left the cemetery, an enormous purple wreath was placed at the grave. It had been sent by the man who for years had operated a service station in town and had profited handsomely from repairing the many wrecked and dented Skakel cars. Back at Lake Avenue, where every room was filled with flowers, the Skakels threw an old-fashioned Irish wake. The house was crammed with so many people it was like the Black Hole of Calcutta with a cocktail party atmosphere, recalled Ethel's cousin, Betty Medale. Ethel and Bobby didn't want to mingle with the herd. Ethel had the look of someone who wished she wasn't there, which I could understand. Being around the Skakels had always made Bobby uncomfortable and moody, but the funeral was more than he could bear. Ethel had hoped to stay a few days with her brothers and sisters, but Bobby was adamant about leaving. As usual, she gave in, and the two of them departed for New York City. That evening, Ethel accompanied Bobby, at his urging, to dinner at his father's favorite restaurant, at 57th and Park, both acting as if nothing had happened. Family members were incensed. Ethel, sometimes you just got to stand up to the man, okay? I know he's controlling and you want to do everything he says, and I get it, blah, blah, blah. But sometimes you need to say, actually, I'm not going to go. My parents are both dead. They both just died in a horrible, horrible plane accident. So you can go and eat dinner with your dad in New York City. I think I'm going to stay here with my siblings. Have a nice night. I mean, at what point are your parents are dead. At what point do you ever planning on standing up for yourself if you can't stand up to your husband when your parents are dead? I guess there's nothing that will make Ethel break free from his controlling hand if this isn't going to do it. After dinner, Bobby telephoned Ethel's pal, Sarah Davis, in Washington. Davis expected to hear sadness in his voice, but instead he sounded normal, and he had a request. When they arrived in Washington, would Sarah please meet Ethel at the airport and take her for a round of golf? Bobby told Sarah that he thought such an outing would take Ethel's mind off the tragedy, so the next day, Ethel and Davis played 18 holes. Not once did Ethel discuss her parents or what had happened to them. She knew they were in heaven, so she knew they were just fine, said Davis later. Back in Greenwich, Connecticut, Georgianne had taken on the responsibility of closing down the Lake Avenue house. Her first act was to give the staff a month to get things in order, along with their salaries in advance. Later, she'd deal with the task of distributing and selling off the furnishings and putting the place on the market. She also decided to stay away from her parents' house, now so devoid of life. A month passed. One morning, as she was opening the mail, Georgianne was surprised to find a bill, requesting payment for several servants who, it appeared, were still working at the house. Thinking there was a mistake after all, she'd personally given them a notice. Georgianne dashed over to Lake Avenue to find out just what had happened. When she arrived, she was dumbfounded to find life going on more or less as usual. Locating the majordoma, Georgianne demanded an explanation. She was informed that because a guest had remained in the house after the funeral, a guest who required constant attention, meals, cleaning, the full range of services, the staff had just assumed that the Skakel family wanted them to remain on duty. And just who was this guest? Georgianne demanded, her voice and blood pressure rising. At that moment, she turned to see the mystery tenant bounding down the staircase, offering her a big smile and a hearty hello. "What the hell are you doing here?" sputtered Georgianne. "I came to the funeral and I decided to stay because it was more convenient than a hotel," was the response of her sister Ethel's brother-in-law, Ted Kennedy. What? If there was ever a character who would show up at this time, it would be Ted Kennedy. Are you kidding me? My mind is blown. I cannot even. If I had written this as a movie script, I never, ever would have done this. Because I would have thought, oh no, nobody would believe that. No one would believe that Ted Kennedy would do this to somebody whose parents had just been killed in a horrific plane crash. No, no, no. That's too much. We can't make him that much of a villain. Believe it! All right. Well, Georgianne raced home and told Johnny Dowdle what had happened. That cheap son of a bitch, he shouted. Ted moved out. Y'all, let me remind you, this was a month after the funeral that she had received this bill. A month. She's trying to get the house cleaned up. She's trying to sell the house. He stayed on for a month at their expense. Dissension also developed between Georgianne and Ethel over the division of the priceless furnishings, antiques, first editions, and art that their mother had collected. Ethel and Bobby were still living with their 4 children in a rented townhouse in Georgetown, but were making plans to buy a larger house, and Ethel wanted some of her mother's better pieces to furnish the new place when the time came. But Georgianne felt she had precedence. She had acted as surrogate mother for Ethel and the others when they were growing up, and she had taken on the responsibility of dealing with various aspects of her parents' estate after their deaths. Georgianne stood firm, and Ethel got only a few pieces. Against everybody's wishes, little Georgianne acknowledged later. My mother got a lot of it. The furniture, paintings, mirrors, books. The sisters and brothers were a little pissed off because the things weren't equally distributed. As they should have been. I mean, I know Georgianne was a surrogate mother, and I'm not saying she couldn't have had some precedence. But to take everything? That seems a little silly. Surprisingly, none of the children wanted the remarkable and magical house where they had grown up. It would have been like living in a hotel, said Jim Skakel. An anachronism for the mid-50s, the Lake Avenue estate remained vacant for some 5 years, until it was finally sold for a mere $350,000. Am I reading that right? $350,000? What? By the 90s, the asking price was $25 million. Okay, that sounds like a figure I could figure it out. Meanwhile, because the Skakels were killed together, the estate tax was enormous. The family, feeling that they were being treated unfairly by the Internal Revenue Service, which pushed hard for payment, now had to come up with millions of dollars in cash or face legal action and huge penalties. Man, the IRS is really just preying on folks, isn't it? They were in a cash bind because they spent everything they made, said Tom Hayes later. In order to pay the IRS, the family had to dissolve Great Lakes Canadian operation, headed by George Terrian. Georgianne also came through with an infusion of cash by using money from her trust fund to buy a hefty chunk of her deceased parents' Great Lakes carbon stock. As a result, she became the company's single largest stockholder, which would cause untold problems and great conflict within the family that would reverberate into the next generation. Since Ethel hid nothing from Bobby, the Kennedys were well aware of the Skakels' money bind, and Bobby took an opportunity to pick up some bargains. The Kennedys were specifically interested in the Palos Verdes property, the promised land to which George and Big Ann were bound when their plane went down. Assigned to make the deal was Jean Kennedy's husband, Steve Smith, the tough and shrewd grandson of an Irish immigrant. Bobby made an effort through Steve Smith to buy the whole real estate division for the Kennedy family, John McCooey said. Steve could smell an opportunity and thought he had a chance to do some cherry picking. But it didn't come to pass because the Skakels saw that if something was worth $1, the Kennedys wanted to pay a dime. Ah, yes, that was rich, was it not? That bit about Ted Kennedy. I had not even gotten to that part. The thing that had blown me away was the death of the parents. Had I but known that that choice gem was coming up, I would have let y'all know at the top of the hour to, hang in for that. What? Okay, well, the next section, so we're done with Bobby's wife. That part is over. Next time we come together, we're going to be reading Chief Counsel's Wife. So I don't know what that's about. But you guys, this book just does not disappoint. Every single time I sit down to read, I'm like, oh, what? What? It's so good. It's so rich. And it's so interesting, too. We don't get bogged down with the boring stories, and that's what I really love. I've read a lot of biographies, and sometimes we just get bogged down in some details. It's like, nobody cares, okay? That's dull. That's boring. Thanks for letting us know, but can we move on? Not so with this book. This book just keeps bringing them, and I'm here for it. All right, I gotta go make breakfast, but I'll see you guys later. Bye.